I dare to say what I feel.
The red-hot iron plunged into the water with a hiss that drowned out every other sound in the stable. Caleb Hartwell held the curved horseshoe against the anvil for another second, the muscles in his forearm taut beneath his rolled-up sleeve, and then dropped it into the bucket. Steam rose between him and the open doorway, and it was through that white curtain that he saw her, standing on the threshold, a covered plate in her hands, saying nothing, waiting for the steam to clear before speaking. "My father doesn't know I'm here," Margaret Calloway said. Caleb wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, leaving a streak of soot that she dared not point out. "Then we both have a secret this afternoon," he replied, and turned back to the anvil, as if his heart hadn't just leaped into his throat. The town of Ashford Creek wasn't much on the map. A single dirt main street, a white church with a steeple crooked from a storm 3 winters past, a general store selling everything from nails to silk ribbons, and, on the outskirts, where the land began to ripple towards the hills, the Hartwell blacksmith shop. Caleb was 26 and had hands that knew every surface of that workshop better than they knew rest. He had inherited the trade from his father, who had died of fever 2 winters ago, and with the trade, he had also inherited the debts, a loan on the land, a mortgage on the tools, and the silent obligation not to fail a town that depended on him to shoe horses, repair plows, and forge the hinges for every new door built between Ashford Creek and the river. He didn't have much. That was simply a fact, not a wound, until it started to become one. He lived alone in the house that had belonged to his parents, a gray wooden structure with a porch that creaked on the second step, and a vegetable garden he tended on Sundays, when the shop closed and his body craved something other than the heat of the forge. He cooked just enough. He mended his own clothes, poorly, with crooked stitches that no one saw because no one entered that house. And every night, before sleep, he counted the coins in a rusted tin can he kept under a loose floorboard, not because he expected them to change, but because counting was a way of telling fear that he was watching it. Margaret Calloway was the only daughter of Thomas Calloway, the man who owned half the arable land in the valley and all of the mill that processed everyone else's grain. Margaret was 24, with a wheat-colored braid that always came undone by the end of the day, and a habit her father considered improper. She spoke to people as if they all had equal worth. She greeted the farmer the same way she greeted the banker. She sat on the steps of the general store, listening to the older women tell stories no one wanted to hear anymore. And for almost a year now, she had been finding reasons, ever weaker, ever more transparent, to pass by the blacksmith shop on her way to nowhere in particular. They had known each other since childhood in a distant way. Caleb was 4 years older, and as a boy she had once seen him pull a frightened horse out of a burning barn with a calmness that made no sense in a 14-year-old. That had stuck with her, that image, long before she knew it had stuck for more than childhood admiration. What had changed in the last year was harder to name. It began with small things. Caleb fixing the fence around the Calloway's vegetable garden without being asked, simply because he passed by one day and saw it down. Margaret leaving him, without comment, the best cut of meat when her family butchered a pig, wrapped in paper and delivered through the workshop window as if it were just a neighborly favor. Neither of them had spoken the word for what they felt. To say it would have been to acknowledge a distance neither knew how to cross. She, the daughter of the valley's fortune. He, the owner of a blacksmith shop with more debts than profits. It's venison stew, Margaret said that afternoon, lifting the plate slightly, as if needing to justify her presence with something tangible. My mother made extra. Your mother never makes extra, Caleb replied, and for the first time, he looked directly at her, with that half smile she had learned to expect and fear in equal measure. No, she admitted. She doesn't. They stood there for a moment, the small, unspoken truth floating between them like the steam that had already dissolved into the afternoon air. The weeks that followed wove a pattern neither named. Margaret began taking the town's mail to the blacksmith shop, even though the route took her nearly a kilometer out of her usual way. Caleb began saving, without telling anyone, the finer ironwork he forged, pieces with an extra curve, a decorative detail no one had asked for, in case he ever had a reason to give them to someone who would appreciate them. They would sit, some afternoons, on the fallen log by the creek that gave the town its name. She with her boots wet up to her ankles, he with his hands still warm from the forge, and they would talk about everything except the one thing that mattered. My father wants me to marry Whitfield's son, she said one afternoon, without looking at him, skipping flat stones across the water. He has land to the north, a good family. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He picked up a stone himself, weighed it in his palm. And what do you want? He finally asked, and the question sounded more dangerous than he intended. What I want isn't part of the conversation, she said, and threw the stone with more force than necessary. But something had changed with that question, though neither of them knew it entirely yet. Something had shifted, like a stone at the bottom of a river that barely alters the current flowing over it. Psychologist Eleanor Maccoby, in her pioneering studies on attachment development, documented that humans form deeper bonds not in grand gestures, but in the constant repetition of small acts of mutual attention. It is that silent accumulation, she said, that ultimately weighs more than any declaration. Autumn arrived with its dry chill and short afternoons, and with it came Daniel Whitfield, mounted on a horse too fine for Ashford Creek's dirt roads, in an imported wool waistcoat and a smile practiced to look sincere. Thomas Calloway greeted him on his porch like one welcomes a solution to a problem, and Margaret greeted him with the cool courtesy of someone who already knows how the play will end before the first act begins. He's a good man, her father told her that night in the dining room as the servants cleared the plates. He has a head for business. He'd give you a life you wouldn't have to think twice about. And what if I wanted to think about it? Margaret asked. Thomas Calloway placed his glass on the table with a dry thud, not violent, but definitive. There are things, Margaret, that a woman in your position cannot afford to think too much about. She didn't answer. But that night, sitting by her bedroom window, she looked south, towards where she knew the blacksmith shop was, though the darkness allowed her to see nothing more than the shape of the hills. Daniel Whitfield wasn't a bad man. That had to be said in his favor. He was, quite simply, a man who had decided Margaret Calloway would be his wife before knowing her well enough to know if it suited her. And he proceeded with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he set out to get. He courted her with gifts, a fine wool shawl, a leather-bound book of poetry, and with polished conversation that never left enough silence for her to think. Caleb learned of Whitfield's visit in the most humiliating way possible. From a customer paying for his horse's shoeing, who commented, without malice, how fortunate the Calloway family was to have secured a son-in-law with such a future. That night, Caleb didn't count the coins in the tin. He stared at the ceiling of his house, listening to the wind move through the boards, and understood something he had been avoiding understanding. That the time he had to say something, anything, was running out, and that he himself, with his silence, had signed the contract of his own defeat. But then, who was he to interfere? A blacksmith with debts doesn't interfere between Thomas Calloway's daughter and a man with land to the north. That was the arithmetic of the world, and Caleb, who had learned to respect arithmetic because his trade depended on exact measurements, couldn't find a way to argue it. Margaret, for her part, began to avoid the path that passed in front of the blacksmith shop. Not because she had stopped wanting to pass there, but because every time she did, she felt she was stealing something from a promise that had never been made aloud, and that perhaps never would be. But it was then, in those weeks of feigned distance, that they both began to understand something neither knew yet how to fully name. Winter announced itself early that year, with a frost that left the creek covered in a thin layer of ice and the roads hardened like stone. Thomas Calloway, eager to advance what he considered inevitable, set a date to formally announce his daughter's engagement to Daniel Whitfield. The Harvest Festival, in less than 3 weeks, in front of the whole town. Margaret received the news in silence. She didn't cry in front of her father. She knew that tears before him were interpreted as weakness, not pain. But that night she walked alone to the creek, not caring about the cold that bit at her ankles, and sat on the fallen log where, so many afternoons, she had spoken with Caleb about everything except the one thing that mattered. Caleb found her there by chance, or perhaps not entirely. He had begun, without admitting it to himself, to walk towards the creek every night with the foolish hope of finding her. 3 weeks, she said, without preamble, when she felt him approach. They're announcing the engagement in 3 weeks. Caleb sat beside her, leaving a distance between them that suddenly seemed absurd, a formality that no longer made sense to maintain. "And you're going to let it happen?" he asked. "What else can I do?" she replied, and for the first time her voice broke, just enough for him to hear it. "My father has already decided. The town already knows. Whitfield has already bought the ring." "That's not what I asked you." Margaret looked at him then, and in the dim light of the moon on the ice, she saw in his face something she had been searching for months without admitting it. Not pity, but the true question, the one that demanded a true answer. "I don't want to marry him," she finally said, and the words came out as if they had been stuck in her throat for a year. "I don't want his wool shawl, or his book of poetry, or his life that I wouldn't have to think twice about. I want to think about it. I want to choose it." Caleb said nothing for a long moment. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was charged with everything neither of them had dared to say in a year of afternoons on that same log. "Margaret," he said finally, his voice low but firm, the voice of a man who had finally decided to stop measuring the risk. "I don't have land to the north. I don't have a fine wool waistcoat or a ring worth as much as yours in gold. I have a blacksmith shop with more debts than customers and a house that needs a new roof before next winter. That's what I am. That's all I have to offer." "I didn't ask you what you have," she said. "I asked you what you feel." And there, on that log by the frozen creek, under a sky that was beginning to release the first loose flakes of the season, Caleb Hartwell understood that he had been wrong all along. It wasn't poverty that had kept him silent. It was fear. The fear of wanting something and losing it, of reaching out and finding only air. I feel that when you come into my workshop, the forge stops being the hottest thing in the place, he said, and the clumsiness of the phrase, its lack of polish, was exactly what made it true. I feel like I've spent a year forging pieces I don't need just to have something to offer you, if I ever found the courage to say this. I feel that I love you, Margaret, in a way I don't know how to justify to your father, or to this town, or to the arithmetic of what I have and what I don't. Margaret didn't answer with words. She took his hand, the rough hand, marked by fire and hammer, the hand of a man who worked to live, not to impress, and held it against her own chest, where her heart beat so hard he could feel it through the fabric of her dress. Then we'll find a way, she said, because I feel that too. I felt it since the burning barn, though I didn't understand it until much later. Before continuing, let me ask you something, because this story is told today in many corners of the world. From what country are you listening to us tonight? The news reached Thomas Calloway's ears 3 days later, carried by a well-meaning neighbor who had seen Margaret and Caleb walking together, unhurriedly, along the road bordering the mill. Thomas didn't yell. Men like him didn't yell. They summoned. He sent for Caleb to come to his house that same afternoon and received him standing in the living room without offering him a seat, with Margaret watching from the kitchen doorway, unbeknownst to her father. "I've been told you've been hanging around my daughter," Thomas said, without preamble. "I haven't been hanging around her, sir," Caleb replied, his back straight and his voice firm, though inwardly every word cost him enormous effort. "I love her, and she, as I understand it, feels the same." Thomas Calloway let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're too poor for my daughter," he said, with the coldness of someone stating an objective fact, not an insult. "You have no land worth mentioning. You have no name that opens doors. You have a workshop that survives on favors and a house that's falling apart. What would you offer Margaret besides a life of hardship?" The silence that followed seemed to last much longer than it actually did. And then, from the kitchen doorway, Margaret spoke, her voice not trembling. "Money doesn't buy what I feel, Papa." Thomas turned towards her, surprised to find her there, even more surprised by the firmness with which she had spoken. "Margaret, Daniel Whitfield offers me land and a name," she continued, advancing towards the center of the room. "Caleb offers me something I could never buy with anything we have. He looks at me and sees someone, not something. He listens when I speak. He doesn't wait his turn to speak. He fixed my fence without being asked and never mentioned it, because he didn't do it for me to know. That's worth more than any acre north of the valley." Dr. Arthur Aron, in his celebrated research on the formation of emotional closeness, demonstrated that true intimacy is born not from the exchange of material goods, but from shared vulnerability sustained over time. It is that mutual risk, he said, that money can never simulate. Thomas Calloway looked at his daughter for a long time, and something in his expression, hardened for so many years by the need to sustain an agricultural empire in a harsh valley, seemed to yield by barely a degree. "You're going to ruin your life," he said, but the conviction in his voice was no longer the same. "It's my life I'm going to live," Margaret replied, "not yours." There was no immediate reconciliation, no movie-like embrace in the middle of the living room. Thomas Calloway was a proud man, and pride doesn't yield in a single day. But that night, after Caleb had already left for his blacksmith shop, the weight of the confrontation still on his shoulders, Thomas sat alone in his study in front of the fireplace and allowed himself to remember something he hadn't allowed himself to remember for years. How he himself, as a young man, had arrived in that valley with nothing more than a borrowed horse and the promise of a woman who had believed in him before he had anything to offer her but that promise. The harvest festival arrived, as time always does without asking permission. But instead of the announcement of Margaret Calloway and Daniel Whitfield's engagement, the town of Ashford Creek witnessed something different. Thomas Calloway, standing before the gathered neighbors under lantern lights strung between the trees, raising his glass not to announce a union of lands, but to acknowledge, his voice a little hoarse from something other than the cold, that his daughter had chosen her own path, and that a father who truly loved her could do nothing but let her walk it. Daniel Whitfield left the valley that same week, his dignity wounded but intact, heading for lands where he would eventually find someone who wanted what he had to offer, without needing anything more. Caleb and Margaret were married in the spring when the creek once again flowed free of ice, and the first green shoots began to appear in the garden he tended on Sundays. The ceremony was small, without the luxury that Thomas Calloway could easily have afforded, because Margaret had insisted it be that way. Simple, honest, made of the same stuff as the love that sustained it. They settled into the gray house with the patched roof, which Caleb was finally able to repair completely with the unexpected and discreet help of his father-in-law, who never called it a favor, but an investment, because admitting tenderness still cost him, though it didn't cost him as much as before. Margaret learned to manage the workshop's books, organizing the accounts with a head for numbers that surprised the whole town except Caleb, who already knew his wife was sharper than any man he had ever met. The business began to grow, not by the Calloway fortune, which Margaret flatly refused to use, but by the constant work of two people who had decided to build something together, brick by brick, horseshoe by horseshoe. The afternoons on the log by the creek became a custom they never abandoned, even years later, even when they no longer needed to escape anything or anyone, to sit there together. 30 years later, Margaret Hartwell, because she had decided from the first day to wear her husband's surname with the same pride he wore it, sat on that same log, now weathered by 3 decades of exposure, her arthritic hands clasped in her lap and her hair completely silver, no longer any trace of that wheat-colored braid that came undone by the end of the day. Caleb arrived walking slowly from the workshop, which was now run by their eldest son with the same inherited skill, and sat beside her as he had done thousands of times before. The fire in his hands had died down over the years, but the memory of its warmth remained in them. The small scars of an entire life of honest work. "Do you remember," she said, taking his hand as she had that first snowy night, "when my father told you you were too poor for me?" Caleb smiled, a slow smile, worn by time but intact in its sincerity. "He was right, in a way," he said. "I was poor. I still don't have the land Whitfield had." "But you had this," Margaret said, bringing his hand to her own chest, where her heart still beat, slower now, but with the same constant rhythm as always. "And this was never priced." The sun cast its low golden light over Ashford Creek Valley, the kind of light that only exists at the end of autumn afternoons, the same light that had illuminated so many other afternoons on that same log, beside that same creek that continued to flow, indifferent to the passage of years, towards a destiny that never changed, even though everything else did.
Because in the end, what distinguishes those who love is not what they can put in our hands, but what they dare to offer when they have nothing left but the truth of what they feel. And perhaps that is the only inheritance truly worth leaving. The certainty, passed down from generation to generation, that the courage to say what one feels is worth more than any fortune that silence can protect.